Hello, this is Meet the Writers. I'm Georgina Godwin. My guest today is the award-winning international editor for Channel 4 News. She's reported from 6 continents, including coverage of the major conflicts in Syria, Iraq, Kosovo, Rwanda and Ukraine in the past 2 decades. She's written other books, including Sandstorm, Libya in the Time of Revolution and In Extremis, the life and death of the war correspondent Marie Colvin, which won the James Tate Black Memorial Prize in 2018 in the biography category. Throughout most of her career, she's carried a book of poetry with her as a way to make sense of the catastrophic events she saw daily. During the Ukraine war, she would post a poem a day on social media. People would read them and ask for more. In her latest work, I Brought the War With Me, she combines her favourite poems alongside memories of her own work, whether speaking to child soldiers in Uganda, soldiers in Ukraine, or giving testimonies of the Rwandan genocide. I Brought the War With Me reveals courage, meaning and unexpected moments of love and care by those affected by conflict and the emotions and consequences that come long after the cameras go. Lindsey Hilsum, welcome to Meet the Writers.
It's lovely to be here, Georgina. Thank you.
I spent so much of my career watching you on television, and of course we first met years and years ago in Zimbabwe when you were covering events there.
We did, many years ago. In fact, somebody was reminding me last night of a time when President Mugabe was on the stage and I was with all the other journalists trying to, get a question in as he would come off. And I asked the most annoying question possible, which was, Mr. President, you seem to speak about Tony Blair a lot, but he never mentions you. Which apparently elicited a furious answer, which I don't recall.
Lindsey, it seems extraordinary, though. I mean, you've got this magnificent career and very dangerous career, but, I mean, you grew up the daughter of a physicist in Malvern.
Yeah, so my father is a scientist. He's 99 and still alive and still inventing things. But yes, he's a scientist. And my mother was a French teacher. But I think in some ways my mother really taught me to appreciate words and to appreciate poetry. And I can remember, in the way of annoying children, I would needle my mother. What do you want me to be when I grow up? What do you want me to be? And she was like, you can be whatever you want to be, whatever you want. I don't mind. And eventually I got her to say, well, I wouldn't mind if you were some kind of writer.
And indeed you are. But I'm interested in how you got to that point, because it wasn't a straightforward progression, was it?
Not at all. So I suppose I was a restless teenager and young adult, and I went to study Spanish and French at Exeter University, which has got to be one of the most tedious places, certainly in this country, if not on the planet. Sorry, people from Exeter who are listening. Anyway, I was bored. And then in the 3rd year, you were supposed to go to either Spain or France to teach English. I thought that sounded dull. And so I just wrote off to anybody I could think of in Latin America, which sounded more like fun, to see if I could get a job there. And my letter, and it was snail mail in those days, we're talking about the 1970s. Anyway, my letter fell on the desk of the Oxfam office in Guatemala when their secretary had fallen pregnant for the 3rd time. And so they just wrote back to me and said, can you type and can you do accounting and can you pay your own airfare out here? And so I wrote back saying yes, yes and yes. So then I went out and bought 2 books, Teach Yourself Typing and Teach Yourself Accounting. Typing I've kind of mastered, accounting never, and went to work as a waitress. And so I went out to Guatemala and started to work for Oxfam, which was in a very lowly position as a volunteer, but it was amazing. And so I started there as an aid worker, and then I became a volunteer for UNICEF, the UN Children's Fund, based in East Africa, in Kenya. So I sort of slithered into journalism through the back door, starting off as an aid worker. I mean, basically, I wanted to change the world, which I think we can agree was one of my less successful projects.
How did you make that transition from aid worker to journalist?
Well, I realised I realised that I really wasn't much use because I wasn't a doctor and I wasn't a nurse and I wasn't an agricultural expert and I was really rubbish at administration. So that I didn't really have a lot to offer as an aid worker, but I could read and write and ask questions. That was kind of it, really, in a couple of languages. And I found that side of it was what I was interested in. So I started to write under a pseudonym, Reba Linden. Reba, who's my favourite character in Song of Solomon by Toni Morrison, and Linden, which I got from my own name. Anyway, Reba Linden wrote a few things, and I just sort of generally started to write, and eventually I managed to. I was very lucky. I decided to make the change during the war in Uganda, where I was, and I worked as a fixer, as we call them, a local person helping a panorama crew from the BBC, and then I got the string for the BBC and the Guardian in Nairobi, so that was how I made the transition.
What would Reba be like now if she still existed?
Oh my God, Reba. I think Reba was a little po-faced. I think Reba really believed in writing very worthy stories, and I think Lindsey became a little more adventurous and a little more mischievous than Reba was.
Yeah. This whole idea of reporting conflict, of being in the places where bad things happen. I mean, you talk a lot in the book, and we'll come on to the structure of it, but about how it can actually be addictive.
Oh, yes. I think that this is a sort of dirty secret that aid workers and journalists, and to some extent volunteer soldiers, not conscripts, share, which is that a lot of people like war. And there is an attraction to it because when you're in a war zone, nothing else matters. That's the only thing that matters, and you're totally focused on the moment. And there's also a camaraderie. I mean, I love my colleagues who I work with. One of the great things about doing television, which I do, is I'm working with a team. And I have to tell you that, when you end up in a dangerous situation and, they're shelling nearby and you have to dive down and then, it's all right, you survive, you run off and, then you have a drink in the evening. That feeling of camaraderie it's one of the greatest feelings that you can have. And so people do get addicted to it. And it suspends real life or other life. You're not arguing about, who's going to cook supper tonight and who's going to take out the rubbish. And the mountains are clearer and the light is brighter. And it's very seductive.
You wrote a book about your friend, Marie Colvin, who herself, I think you say in this book, was addicted to war. Yeah,
she was. Marie was I called the book In Extremis because it's something she said about what she reported on. She said, I report on people living in extremis. But she also lived her own life in extremis. I mean, lovers, drugs, drink, crazy parties, all of that. And, she had that kind of personality. And she was an extraordinary journalist. She was absolutely brilliant. But she was also reckless, and she took it too far. And not to put too fine a point on it, she was killed in Syria going into a place and then back into a place in Homs, which was really too dangerous. And she died. And that's probably why, she's dead and I'm still alive. After that, people would say, why don't you write your own memoir, Lindsey? And I'd say, what do you want me to call it? Pale Shadow?
Well, the way you've done it is absolutely beautiful because it's not exactly a memoir,
no.
But there are wonderful vignettes of people and of things and of places that you've come across in your career. Just explain the structure of the book to our listeners because it's beautifully done.
Thank you, Georgina. Look, the way it started was, as you said at the beginning, I've always carried a book of poetry with me. And in fact, in those days in Latin America at the beginning, I remember I typed out my favourite poems and I had a little sheaf of them with me. And I was looking for it the other day. I can't find it, but I know it's somewhere. So I always carry poetry with me because it's a couple of things. It sort of, yes, it provides some kind of solace. And it's also, poets have the words that journalists don't have. We get to a certain point, I think, as journalists in describing what's going on. And we need to be clear and we need to tell the readers and the viewers what we've seen. But there's an elusive quality to poetry, which, gives you much more depth. And so that's why I've always turned to it. And at the beginning of the war in Ukraine, I was in Kramatorsk, which is in the east, and I was reading a lot of poetry. And I was just so shocked at what I was witnessing. I was witnessing this invasion then in the 21st century in Europe. And I started to tweet out a poem a day, and people responded, and they wanted more poetry. And then I ran out of poems that I knew, and I started to have to look for more. So that was how the idea of the book came up. And then I was thinking, I'm going to twin a story, something I've written from my experience of conflict, with a poem. And I'll do 50 stories and 50 poems. I thought, well, I can't do it by geography because that would sort of make it uneven, and I can't do it chronologically. So I've done it by theme. So, children, refugees, love, courage, history, these kind of things. And each section has 5 stories and 5 poems, because where I think it works for me best is my stories are specific. They're in a time and a place. But I have often twinned a story with a poem which comes from a completely different time and place, because some things about war are universal, and I was trying to bring some of that out.
Absolutely. In the first section, fighters, this is in the Donbass, and you are really in a very, very dangerous situation.
Yeah, so I was in a trench. And, of course, when you're in a muddy trench in the winter and you've had a British education, you're just thinking about World War I, and you're thinking about the Somme. And that was exactly what it was like. We were sloshing through the trench with these Ukrainian soldiers. And I should say that the Russian soldiers were in similar trenches, but we can't access them because Russia won't let us in. And then we were there, and then suddenly we heard a which was sniper shot overhead. So we slide down in the trench. And I was thinking, for us it was this brief moment of jeopardy. But for the Ukrainian soldiers, this was what their winter was going to be like, in this muddy, freezing cold trench with the Russian snipers who were only 500 metres away. And so, of course, I was thinking of World War I. And I talked to a young soldier called Vadim, and I said, why are you fighting? And he was unbelievably idealistic. He said, I'm fighting for democracy, I'm fighting for a free country, because I want to bring up a child in this country as a free nation. And that made me think of A.E. Housman. I'm going to read it. It's just such a short poem, Here Dead We Lie, by A.E. Housman, which was written in 1922, actually. Here dead lie we, because we did not choose to live and shame the land from which we sprung. Life, to be sure, is nothing much to lose, but young men think it is, and we were young.
It's very moving, isn't it?
It is, and to me that's Vadim.
Yeah. He had a kitten with him, didn't he?
He had a kitten called Olyenka. I have to say that that story, which is a TV story online, it did tremendously well, because it had not only your correspondent's head nearly being shot off, but it also had a cat. So, it was online gold. To bring the tone down, sorry.
War, but also love, and many different kinds of love. You talk about relationships between people. One that still survives. The couple is now in London after a horrible kind of time. But the one I'm very interested in here is about a mother's love. And this is what happened to you in Rwanda.
In Rwanda. Yeah, I mean, love... When I was writing the book, there was a point where I thought, oh, God, this is gloomy. Nobody's going to want to read this. And I thought, well, try and think of what are the good things, as it were. And I thought, well, love is so intense in wartime. And, certainly that, people fall in love very passionately. And, sex is much better under the bombs. I mean, I wouldn't know that, obviously, but that's what people tell me. And so you do get this very profound love, but the story that you're mentioning, I'm afraid, is a sad story, because it was my friend Monica. So I happened to be in Rwanda when the genocide started. I was working. It's a long story, but basically, my journalistic career had hit a bit of an obstacle, and so I had gone back to being an aid worker for a bit, and I was working for UNICEF. And what it meant was I was there for 2 months living in Rwanda in 1994, and then the genocide broke out. And so then I reverted to being a journalist again. And Monica was the wife of a colleague of mine at UNICEF. And this was without question the worst week of my life. That through that first week of the genocide, when I didn't really understand what was going on, I just, it was just terrifying. and a lot of people were being killed. And my colleagues from UNICEF, many of whom were Tutsis, which is the ethnic group that was the target of the killers, were ringing me up and asking me to save them. And then Monica rang me up and asked me to write down a message to her husband who was travelling because she knew she was going to die. And she knew that her 5 children would be okay because they were staying with the grandparents in the village. So I wrote down Monica's message to Marcel. But Monica survived and the 5 children were killed. And in the village, the killers were the neighbours, as it happened all over Rwanda, and they slaughtered the grandparents and they slaughtered Monica and Marcel's 5 children. And, I mean, the pain that Monica felt and the profundity of her love for her children is, I mean, it's beyond imagination, isn't it?
It really is. And the poem that went with that is the Karen Gershon.
So I twinned Monica's story with a poem I've known a long time. In fact, it was a poem I read in a competition at school, would you believe it, called I Was Not There by Karen Gershon. Karen Gershon is a Holocaust survivor, and she discovered after the war that her parents had been killed in a camp. And she was haunted by the fact that she wasn't there. I was not there to comfort them. It has, this recurring line, I was not there to comfort them. And I felt that was what Monica felt, this of not being there in this moment. Shall I read a little bit of it?
Yes.
The morning they set out from home, I was not there to comfort them. The dawn was innocent with snow, in mockery. It is not true. The dawn was neutral, was immune. Their shadows threaded it too soon. They were relieved that it had come. I was not there to comfort them.
I mean, this book is full of these heart-stopping moments. And as you say, poetry can explain it sometimes so much better than any journalist. You also go into history, and of course history written by the victors normally, but you're in this wonderful, unique position where in many situations you can see both sides. So you've reported from the West Bank and you've reported from Israel, and of course everybody has a completely different perception of what happens there. And I found that very interesting, you telling us the stories from both sides and talking about the contested history.
People go to war over history. Why has Vladimir Putin invaded Ukraine? It's because of a vision of history. He thinks he's Peter the Great, and he believes that Ukraine is not a real country. He thinks it's Little Russia. And he wrote a long and unbelievably tedious essay explaining his version of history, and it is a war of imperial reconquest. And then culture comes into the history as well, because in Ukraine now there's an absolute outpouring of poetry, lots and lots of poets, but also all sorts of Ukrainian culture is being promoted because it's an assertion of self against this twisted version of history. And I mean, just a short quote from there's an Irish musician called Frank Hart who said, "Those in power write the history; those who suffer write the songs." And that was sort of in my mind throughout this book. But yes, I mean, I was in Jenin in 2002. Jenin being a town on the West Bank, which the Israelis had a big assault on because there'd been terrorist attacks by Palestinian groups in Israel, and they thought that a lot of the people who'd carried those out were in Jenin. But in the way of those wars, the territory is disputed. Is it Israeli? Is it Palestinian? Well, it's Palestinian land, and the Israelis are laying claim to it. But then you can go back and back and back and back and back. Who owned it in the Bronze Age? Who owned it in the Stone Age? How far do you want to go back? And of course, we're seeing that now. And, you've got the horrendous situation in Gaza of, about 45,000 people who've been killed now. And now you're seeing Israeli settlers saying that they want to go in and resettle Gaza and claiming a history there which I would say doesn't exist. History is always contested and history is always dangerous.
You write a section on courage, and again, many sort of very moving and very powerful stories come up in that. But I was quite interested in the one about being in Mexico. I mean, it is a war of sorts, yes, because you were kind of hanging out with the narcos.
Yeah, so, I mean, the story from Mexico, I mean, Mexico, it is a war. There's extreme violence, the cartels there. I went to Culiacan, which is the headquarters of the Sinaloa cartel. It was extraordinary. We went with this, there's this guy called Javier, and Javier was an amazing local journalist who was very, very careful. You know, he was okay with the police, he was okay with the cartels, he was okay with everybody, and he was an amazing guide for us because he took us into the cemetery. I've never seen anything like it. So the cemetery, you've got these mausoleums and these huge photographs of the deceased, and the deceased are all young men between about, 16 and 40. They're all narcos, and they're all with these huge rifles across their chests. It's unbelievably sort of belligerent image. And these people, mainly women, having picnics in the mausoleum. And so this was an extraordinary scene. And Javier said to us, okay, you've got 15 minutes to film and then you better go. And so we did. And then he took us to meet, there was a couple of narcos who we met. Anyway, it was extraordinary. And he knew how to navigate this territory, and I thought he was the bravest journalist I'd ever met. And then about 2 years after I was there, he was killed. He was shot by a narco who didn't like what Javier had written about him. And Mexico is one of the most dangerous places in the world for journalists. Not foreign journalists visiting, Mexican journalists. And the most dangerous place for journalists in the world now is Gaza.
Yes.
Foreign journalists aren't allowed in. It's all Gazan journalists, Palestinian journalists.
You write about landscape, and there are so many wonderful bits I'd like to focus on. But in fact, in Niger, you say across the Sahel, it's not war that creates the landscape, but the other way round. And I just thought this chapter was so interesting about the impact of climate change on land and how it does drive conflict.
Absolutely. And the Sahel, more than anywhere else, we really see this because you've always had a sort of incipient conflict between settled farmers and herders. You know, what land is available for cultivation and what land is available for your herds of cattle and camels and goats and so on. And those disputes, there were always disputes, but they were sort of solved by the elders. But now, with climate change and desertification, this is life and death. And then the jihadis come in. So the jihadis come in and they start to pay and arm the herders. And suddenly what was a conflict over land now becomes an ideological conflict, which it never was before. And so you have this really potent and dangerous mixture of jihadism and climate change. And that is happening all across the Sahel. Can I read the poem I put with that? Because this is one of the ones which is such a stretch, as it were, across time. But it's called Epic, and it's by Patrick Kavanagh, who is an Irish poet in the 1960s. And it's about what makes a war, what matters more. Is it the big forces or is it the small local things? And that's exactly what these things are about. So I have lived in important places, times when great events were decided. Who owned that half a rood of rock, a no-man's land surrounded by our pitchfork-armed claims? I heard the Duffies shouting, "Damn your soul!" and old McCabe, stripped to the waist, seen step the plot-defying blue cast steel. Here is the march along these iron stones. That was the year of the Munich bother. Which was more important? I inclined to lose my faith in Ballyrush and Gortin, till Homer's ghost came whispering to my mind. He said, I made the Iliad from such a local row. Gods make their own importance.
Excellent poem.
Isn't that a brilliant poem?
Yeah.
And it's about Niger.
Yeah. And I mean, what of course is going to happen there is that then drives migration, doesn't it?
Of course.
And you have a wonderful section on refugees, also on prison, on children. Absolutely terrifying bit about child soldiers.
Oh my God.
You talk about warlords, and then you come to memory, and this is really where we came in because in this you talk about being in Balagwe in Zimbabwe.
Yeah, which is a place you, of course, are very familiar with. And one of the things about Zimbabwe is the importance of the spirits. And this is where journalists fail so much that we don't understand what matters to people. I'm talking about Western journalists. We go out to all these places and, we don't understand how much poetry matters to a lot of people. We also don't understand about the spirit world. And in Zimbabwe, I think that's more acute than anywhere else I know, that the spirits are always there. And with the genocide in Matabeleland at in the late 1970s, they were never allowed to bury the people who were killed. Mugabe's people went and killed an awful lot of people who were of a different ethnic group and also supported a different political party. And those people were never allowed to give them a proper burial. And that is so haunting and so important. And eventually, when Mugabe died, I went back to that area and I talked to people about that. And we went to the places where people, went where somebody thought their uncle was buried and where they wanted to dig him up and give him a proper burial and so on. And I remember one old man whose uncle had been killed, I think. I asked him, I said, do you think Mugabe is at peace now that he's dead? And his boy said, not so much.
What I also love about this is that you've chosen a poem from somebody who's a very dear friend, I think, to us. Certainly is the partner of a very dear friend of ours.
Yeah, this is by Andrea Cohen, who's a great American poet. And it's called Explanation Hiroshima. And it's about exactly that. It's about why memory is important. Why, you don't just forget. You have to remember. And I know we have this idea of never again, and that doesn't quite work. But still, you have to remember because nobody wants people to die in vain. And there is a way of remembering that you hope will stop repetition. And this is about Hiroshima. You have to explain to the new girl, you always do, to the one who means staying late, to scrub the stain from the marble stair displayed at the museum. You have to explain that the darkness is not a stain she can erase. Rather, it's a shade and shadow, a stranglehold that's all that's left of a girl and a boy who sat on the school stair, as children do, and vanished. You have to explain, we guard the stain.
Oh, Lindsey, it's all very, very moving, and we're sadly almost out of time. I just wanted to talk about the graphics on the front because I think this is absolutely brilliant cover.
I'm so glad you like it. I love it. So the cover, which I should explain, it's bright blue, like a very bright blue sky, and then it has 3 jet planes. It has 3 jet bombers flying with a white dove, and this was designed by Daria Filipova, who is a Ukrainian artist. And I think it's marvellous because obviously, I mean, it's symbolic and so on, but it is very striking. And the fighter bombers and the dove go all the way through. And I mean, that's what I'm trying to convey. I'm trying to convey that the dove, the poems, they're also an integral part of warfare.
And in this sort of ephemeral world of journalism, of television, these stories disappear, but those poems are forever.
That's exactly the point of it, that we don't really read the journalism of World War I anymore, do we? But we read Wilfred Owen, Siegfried Sassoon, and we always will.
And we should all be reading I Brought the War With Me, stories and poems from the front line by Lindsey Hilsum. Thank you so much, Lindsey.
I've really enjoyed it, Georgina. Thank you.
I Brought the War With Me, stories and poems from the front line is published by Chatto and Windus. It's out now. You've been listening to Meet the Writers. Thanks to my producer, Steph Chungu, who also edited this episode. And you can download this show and previous episodes from our website, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Georgina Godwin. Thanks for listening.